Obviously, they had some hot takes. This is a conference that people look forward to every year. It hasn't happened for the past 3 years because of the pandemic. But 2022, it was back, and it was back, and it was roaring. Warren Buffett made the claim that if you gave him $25 or if he owned all the world's Bitcoin for $25, he would not own it because it's not worth $25. Let's start off with you, Justin. Is Warren Buffett correct that Bitcoin is worthless? And if you don't agree with him, do you at least get his perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think for once I get the perspective, because the actual quote from this shareholder meeting, like, we already knew they're too old and stodgy for Bitcoin, let alone really the internet. Like, Apple's the most forward-thinking investment they've really made up until this Activision Blizzard stuff, whatever. But he actually was using that as an example. He said, if you gave me, if for $25 billion, I could own 1% of all the farmland in America, I would write you a check tomorrow. If I could own 1% of all apartment buildings for $25 billion, I would write you a check tomorrow. But if you gave me all the Bitcoin for $25, I wouldn't write you that check, because then I would own 100% of this thing, and I would just have to I would have to sell it back to you. Versus if you owned any of the other assets, they're producing stuff, income, whatever. And so I kind of it was actually quite a good analogy. I mean, he's getting a little old, so it's a little bit harder to follow, but it was a pretty good analogy, and I understand it. And he was just making the point about, this is like, there's only one money, it's US dollars, and Bitcoin is only worth whatever you can sell this other person. And then he went into art, which is kind of interesting. So I would just say it is much more like, if I wouldn't buy all of Bitcoin for $25 billion, even though, because, then you own the whole thing. The whole value of a network is that other people are on it and using it as well. So I think he kind of is hitting on some stuff there, but I'll let Tom talk.
Tom, I see you've got a Coke can. Are you channeling your inner Warren Buffett here?
I'm a Coke head.
You're a Coke head. What were your thoughts on Buffett's quotes?
So obviously he's exaggerating a little bit, but that's not the main point. Here's the main point. So first of all, I think he could do a risk arbitrage deal, because if Bitcoin crashes, probably Elon Musk will buy it at $69.42. So he'll make the difference from that to his $25. Now, on a serious note, the big problem with Warren Buffett's analysis is not that he hates Bitcoin. I think there's a fundamental flaw in the way old school investors analyze Bitcoin. They don't view Bitcoin correctly. And that's partially the fault of the IRS and the Western tax authorities. So if you remember, when Bitcoin came out, there was a big discussion. What is Bitcoin? Is it an asset or is it a currency? Because if it's a currency, if it's just money, you don't tax people when they exchange money, right? But because the IRS and the rest of these Western tax authorities got so greedy, they pushed to define Bitcoin as an asset so they can tax every exchange, which was a douchey thing to do. But I mean, what do you expect? It's the IRS. But that started a whole misunderstanding of Bitcoin, of investors looking at it as an asset. Oh, this asset, it doesn't have an intrinsic value. I mean, my guy, money doesn't have any intrinsic value, but people still willing to pay for it. The whole idea, I think, where he needs to, in his age, I don't know if he can at this point. I mean, he's already old, and his respect, I mean, I don't mean to disrespect him, but I'm saying, if you just understand that this is currency to preserve value and not an asset, it's like saying, well, what's the intrinsic value of $1? I mean, it's nothing. It's just whatever people are willing to pay for that. That's the whole problem here.
I actually have to push back on Tom here this morning. I think it is an asset. I think it's gold. I think it's cannibalizing gold. Anybody under the age of whatever, 30, 35, like I own 0 gold. I own a bunch of Bitcoin, right? Like that's but it doesn't fully one-to-one replace it, but it's like gold. But guess what? Gold appreciation is taxed, and it kind of should be as capital gains. And guess what? If you are an FX trader and I'm making money on these little trades with like the US dollar to Japanese yen currency, I'm almost positive that gets taxed with cap gains too. So look, like there are currency transactions and there are making money, and I think it should be taxed as such.
No, that's a horrible take, and I'll explain. It's a very common mistake, and I'm surprised actually that you made this analogy because it's so bad. The thing about gold as an analogy for Bitcoin, why it's so horrible, because gold has intrinsic value. Gold has actual use cases. There are things you can do, underlying uses for gold, which can be applicable. which initially creates some sort of a value for gold beyond just a reserve of value.
So it's a commodity.
For whatever it is, there are uses, there is value in gold, even if it's not just a store of value. Currencies, by definition, has absolutely no use other than just to be an exchange of money, an exchange of wealth. And that's why Bitcoin is definitely not gold. And I'm surprised that you, as a proponent of Bitcoin, would push this narrative, even though it means you're going to get cap gains tax every time you exchange Bitcoin.
Well, to my point, like 5 more seconds though, and then you can respond, Tom. I just think that like even if you're trading Japanese yen and you make money on it, the IRS comes at it. They treat that as cap gains too. So I'm just saying, like, it's not like it makes sense why they do it, because it's basically the US dollar is the US currency and they're going to tax the crap out of anything that isn't the US dollar. That's all I'm saying.
That's inaccurate. They'll only tax you on Forex if there's a difference in value. If you're exchanging a dollar for the equivalent of a dollar of a Bitcoin, that should not be taxable, and yet it is.
Yeah, but Bitcoin is not a stable coin. So that, I mean, by definition, there's going to be a difference in value.
Tax principles are the same. If you exchange something of value, if it's a currency for the same amount of currency, there's no Forex gaps, there's no capital gains tax. That's not true.
Okay, we need a longer discussion. Maybe I don't have popular opinions on this.
We need a longer discussion to expose how much of a flawed analogy it is to say it's gold. I was embarrassed for you, actually.
If it's not a stable coin, like obviously there's going to be fluctuations in value if it's not a stable coin.
What is the use case of Bitcoin? What can you do with Bitcoin?
It's storing value on the internet.
What can you do with it? Is there a use case? Is there utility for Bitcoin? There is for gold.
Well, I don't even know if we're arguing about the same thing. I'm just saying it makes sense that the IRS is treating it as such.
No, the only reason the IRS is treating it as such is because it's greed. They get to tax cap gains on currencies. Beautiful. Greedy.
All right. We will revisit that topic and we'll see how Bitcoin ultimately plays out. And if Warren Buffett ends up being right, that Bitcoin might go to zero.